Well, welcome. My name is Steve Gauck. I'm the Regional Agronomy Manager for the Eastern region of Beck's Hybrids. And with me today, I have some fellow agronomists from the Eastern region, and we're going to talk about the tar spot. So we're going to start off with Travis. Introduce yourself, Travis.
Travis Burnett. I would be the Northern Indiana agronomist, with the exception of a few counties up there that Aaron will, I'm sure, talk about. But basically north of Highway 70, state of Indiana.
Yep, and I'm Aaron Brooker. I'm the Michiana agronomist. I cover Michigan and a few counties in northwest Indiana.
And I'm Mike Hannewald. I cover northern Ohio as the agronomist, and then also a few counties in northeast Indiana.
All right, gentlemen, we're here today to talk about tar spot, right? It's the hot topic in the industry, especially in your areas. And we're seeing a lot of yield differences, variation, stock, lots of stuff going on with tar spot, right? But there's a lot of questions that come with it, and probably a lot of assumptions being made too about tar spot. So let's go into a little bit of the history of tar spot. So Mike, why don't you tell us about kind of the basics of tar spot, where it came from, and where it's going?
Yeah, so from where I'm at in northern Ohio, it feels like tar spot's something brand new, but we've had it for several years. It was first found in 2016 in Illinois and Wisconsin. We had found out there, and then slowly spread and really blew up the first time in 2018 in western Michigan. West central Michigan was up there. And it's slowly spread. In 19, it was fairly widespread and got down into Ohio just a little bit, across northern Indiana. But then in 20, we didn't see a whole lot of it. 2020 was a little bit drier year, and that was kind of our assumption was, well, in a drier year, we may not see as much. And it didn't cause many problems. But then this year, in 2021, it has just overtaken the northern Corn Belt, northeastern Corn Belt areas, and has spread pretty dramatically.
So Mike, there's the history of it, right? If I'm out in the field looking at it, I'm getting a lot of assumptions of what does tar spot look like out in the field right now?
Yeah, so it looks just like the name. Looks like spots of tar. As if you took a paintbrush and stuck it in a bucket of paint and just dabbed it all over the leaves. So the way to identify it for sure is to take a look at the leaves and just take your finger and try and rub the spots off. Once the disease is fully established in the leaf, it'll show up on both the upper and lower sides of the leaves, and you cannot scratch those lesions off without damaging the leaf. So that's the easiest way to know for sure.
Okay, great. So Travis, we're kind of talking about what it is and how to identify it. So maybe give us a little bit of what's the life cycle of it, right? When do I expect to see it? What kind of temperatures are going to make it grow? And then we're going to play a little bit of Mythbusters, right? Because we've got all these stories, because it's so new, we're still learning, right? And how's it affecting, and everybody's got their own kind of story. So we'll kind of move into that. But first, start off with, let's talk about the life cycle of it and what kind of weather conditions do we need for tar spot?
Yeah, so prior to it coming up here in the States for the Corn Belt, kind of originated in Central America, okay? And one of the things when we first saw it back in 2016, 17 time frames, when we first started digging in, trying to learn about this, one of the first things that we thought we knew was that we didn't think that we'd be able to overwinter in our residue, which we've since proven wrong, right? And hence why we're here talking about today. But typically, this disease likes cool, moist conditions. That's typically what it thrives in. But we thought that our winters up here would be harsh enough to actually kill that pathogen, and we wouldn't have a recurring problem with residue and inoculum with that overwintering. So that's one of the things that we have kind of disproven. Okay, that school of thought. But really, what's interesting with tar spot, and what makes it maybe tougher to control than others, is kind of how it disperses or is spread. Okay, so like some other diseases, if it does overwinter in the residue, you can get infection from the inoculum that's in your own soil. Okay, so there's things that we can do to manage diseases like that with managing residue and tillage and lots of different things there. Crop rotation being another one. But what makes this disease so tough is that's not the only way in which this disease spreads. So those spores can actually get airborne up on the wind currents. In fact, Mike, what's your $4 word?
Tar spot has a steep dispersal gradient.
Steep dispersal gradient. So basically that
Big word for today.
Yeah, it actually explodes, for lack of a better word, up into the air. Okay, somewhere up around 200 feet is how far they can travel without any outside influence. Okay, so you start adding wind and different things into that. Think of how far the spores can actually move. and it gets kind of along those wind currents and gets spread across, a big area real fast. And really that's what makes tar spots so hard to challenge or so hard to manage, and it's been challenging for us to figure out the last few years. It really doesn't matter what your rotation is, right? It doesn't really matter if you had tar spot last year or you have an inoculum in your soil. What's happening on a bigger scale? Okay, what do your neighbors have? Was it in their fields last year? How much corn on corn acres are in your general area? There's lots of little patterns that we're picking up on. That's what makes this disease a little tougher to manage versus some others because of how aggressively it spreads based off of how it can move with those wind currents.
The one slight silver lining to that aggressive spread, though, is it's easy to scout for. You don't have to hunt and find it and scout every acre of every field. When it hits a field, it's going to hit the whole field pretty evenly, and it's very easy to find once it does show up.
Correct.
So Aaron, when it does show up, what kind of time frame are you looking at before it starts to do damage?
Yeah, so as far as when it's traditionally shown up, it's kind of varied year to year, and that's what's making it so hard for us to come up with really good recommendations to control this disease year to year. And so certain years we've seen it come in early. This year would be a great example of that. We saw it even sometimes pre-tassel this year. Some of those early lesions coming up mostly on the lower parts of those plants early on. Last year, Mike mentioned it came in quite late. Some cases it came in heavy late last year, but it didn't have that early infection period. That's one of the things we think is quite different this year. So we're not sure exactly on that time frame year to year. And Travis mentioned those conditions. It likes those cool, moist type of conditions to infect, but we're just not sure. We can't predict the weather that well to know exactly when that's going to occur year to year. So
The interesting thing with tar spot is, to kind of Aaron's point there, it's from what we've seen, it's either a disaster or it's really no big deal at all. And just because you have the black spots show up on your leaf doesn't mean that it's going to be a disastrous yield impact. It's about, to Aaron's point, it's about the timing of when that infection occurs as to whether or not you've got the potential for disaster or whether it's just cosmetic and you can still have great yielding corn. Now, for my area in northern Ohio this year, most of it's been a pretty minimal yield impact. It looks ugly, but next year that could be different.
yeah, and add on to what Mike said as far as the yield impact, that's one of the big things we see with this disease. If it comes in early, we can see a lot of grain fill impact and actually impact our corn yields, and so that can be a major impact of this disease. But a lot of what we've seen this year, we had that early infection period, kind of sat latent there for a while, and then we had that big explosion later in the season. A lot of the problems we're seeing this year is mostly with that stand loss. We do have areas that had that actual yield loss, that grain fill disruption there, but we are seeing a lot of standability issues this year. And I think Travis can dive into more of why we're seeing that.
So to not overcomplicate things, but to add to what both Mike and Aaron mentioned there, and to reiterate what Mike said, the majority of the area that I cover, so think of the north central portion of the state, I can take you to every field and show you tar spot lesions and still have a crop standing, right? So it's everywhere. But to Mike's point, it came in late enough that it really wasn't yield influencing, okay, for most of those situations. Now, the thing that we have found, and kind of one of the keys around managing or kind of looking for tar spot or getting a better handle on how big of a yield penalty there's going to be with tar spot, it really revolves around what other stressors are impacting that plant. Okay, so in situations, and this is what we saw some of the early years of tar spot, where that plant is feeling good, right? It's not really wanting for anything from a nutritional standpoint, especially when we have good conditions during grain fill. Tar spot seems to not really matter a whole lot. Again, just because you have some lesions on the plant, not that big of a deal. The problem we ran into this year is all of the other stressors that were kind of stacked on that plant during grain fill. So things like, one of the big things was we had a lot of nitrogen deficiency this year. Not because anybody did anything wrong with managing nitrogen, but it's the cards we were dealt with weather, right? We had pretty significant rains early on in the year during the vegetative stages when that plant was taking up a lot of nitrogen. So we had a lot of nitrogen deficiency later in the year. That was one of the stresses that we've seen kind of widespread. Another one, had a lot of warm nighttime temperatures during grain fill. Had a lot of cloudy kind of hazy days. I remember the wildfires and how hazy the sunny days were, during grain fill. That's not, all these things are basically that triggers that plant into cannibalizing resources from the stalk and the roots and the leaves, so the vegetative parts of that plant. So once that process starts, that's where we see tar spot come in and really, I think of it as a kind of an opportunistic type of disease. It kind of sits there latent maybe in the plant, doesn't do a whole lot, but when that plant's under stress for other reasons, the synergism of tar spot and those other stressors really take that plant down very fast. Okay, I mean, in some cases, less than 3 weeks. We see plants go from green to brown, and that's all contributing to the standability issues that we're seeing widespread this year that Eric mentioned, right? Once that first domino falls, that first stressor falls, and we start stacking all these things on top of each other, we're really aggressively trying to rob carbohydrates from that stalk to finish that grain or to put on viable seed on that grain or on that ear. And we're left with a very skeleton type like stalk, and any sort of winds or other things, we're going to have some issues with sustainability, and we're forced to deal with that this year.
So what you're saying then is that because of all these additional stressors we've had through the 2021 growing season have made the tar spot issue worse than maybe it is?
That's my belief. I guess our belief. We talk about this pretty regularly.
Yeah, I think that's been a major issue, traditionally for sure, and into northern and central Indiana, definitely. With that rainfall, I think we lost a lot of nitrogen earlier in the season, and so I think that's caused a lot of additional stress, just like Travis said.
So in 2022 then, if I put extra nitrogen on and give it plenty of fertilizer, I won't have any tar spot issues?
Well, I think that just becomes difficult to predict again. I mean, we can't see what the weather's going to do, so you can put on all the additional nitrogen you want, and we can get 8 inches of rain again, and that nitrogen's going to be gone just like
another fun thing to talk about. So the other year where tar spot was really bad would have been 2018, right? So think back to that year, there's the reason tar spot was bad that year, there was actually another disease that came in earlier in a big way that started to compromise that plant's immune system more or less, okay? That was gray leaf spot. That was a really, really big gray leaf spot year. So again, just like all the other stresses I mentioned from 2021, this last year, once that plant is compromised, that's where the tar spot can be really devastating.
So ultimately then, you got to manage the crop to be as successful as you can. Now just help keep the tar spot somewhat at bay, right? It's not perfect.
Same thing can be said for any disease, right? I mean, it's not just tar spot, just that one seems to be a little more aggressive than some others that we're used to dealing with.
Yeah, especially here in the northern territories.
Okay. So before we kind of get into a plan for next year, we've seen this thing move a little bit through northern Indiana, right? I'm from southern Indiana. I get the opportunity to work all the way down into Kentucky, Tennessee. We saw tar spot a little bit everywhere, right? Obviously not yield robbing. Do we think it's going to be a nationwide issue? Do we think it's going to stay isolated? Where do we think it could go?
And that's where, when you look at what we thought we knew about tar spot, is somewhat changing. So it started off, Illinois kind of moved up into Wisconsin, Michigan, northern Indiana, then into northern Ohio, and we thought, well, that makes sense. It seems like cooler, damper conditions, and so as you move further south, you have fewer, your nights are warmer, you don't have those cool day conditions. But then this year, kind of turned that on its head. It's still spread there. So for the guys that I work with in northern Ohio, northeast Indiana, I've been saying, I think this is going to be something we've talked about. Gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight every year. We're just going to add tar spot to that list. As far as for the more southern territories where it just got to this year, I think the jury's still out on that. We'll have to see how it behaves in the future.
Very good. Well, I know in 2018 you saw some down south, then saw none again until this year. So it's interesting where it travels, why, and what triggers it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, Steve, because even up north where we tend to think this disease is the bigger problem, I think that's a good point to make, that 2018 was bad year. 2019, very, very limited pockets of tar spot. 2020 came in late, and now this year it's big again. What the pattern is that we're not necessarily seeing a pattern yet. So as much as we want to be able to prepare for this disease and be able to control it the best we can, we also have to realize, just with any of our other diseases, it's likely to be pretty cyclical. going to affect pockets each year, potentially going to be widespread, on a given year. But it's definitely something to keep in mind with the patterns of when it's going to affect year to year.
Okay. So let's start to switch a little bit. Let's think about 2022. Right? What am I doing today to make plans to help me with tar spot next year? Right. So the first thing I think about is seed ordering. Right. We're a seed company, about ordering seed. So are there hybrid differences? Are there genetic differences? Are there some things I should consider? Or does it not matter? Hey, every hybrid's going to have the opportunity to get it, and just order the best product for your acre.
All Beck's hybrids are immune to tar spot. So
Make this say video's over.
absolutely not the case, right? There is some genetic differences, right? And we see that, and it's one of the tools that we can use to manage this disease, especially in those areas where we've been dealing with it for 4 or 5 years now, where there's a lot of corn on corn, where there's a lot of irrigated acres, where you have longer periods of that leaf wetness and the environment where that thing really thrives. Those areas, it's definitely something we need a tool we can use, right, in those situations. Now, it's not the only tool, and that's the biggest thing we want to mention here. My area, like I said before, 3/4 or probably more than 80% of it, tar spot really wasn't a yield limiting factor. Yet every week I'm getting phone calls around, hey, I need to know what tar spot ratings are in every one of these hybrids. That's the first thing that some guys want to select around. Well, that's not the message we want to get out there, right, with tar spot, especially in those areas where it's less likely to be a problem, because there's a lot of other factors we need to select around to get the right genetics on the right acre. And tar spot can be a piece of that, but it certainly shouldn't be the first sort. Okay, when you think about selecting a hybrid, in the majority of the situations that all three of us are selling it, right?
Yeah. I think just to add on to that, for me, a couple of key things when we think about hybrids, a lot of it goes back to what Travis was talking about with the different stressors that our plant goes through and how that contributes to tar spot. We can actually look at these different hybrids, and some of them, they vary in their nitrogen use and when they need nitrogen and how much nitrogen they need and how they respond to that. So plants this year, hybrids this year that didn't respond well to that reduced nitrogen, those nitrogen deficiencies, we're actually seeing those compounded with tar spot fare a little bit worse this year. Just the combination. So that, I think we're definitely seeing some hybrid differences there, and so it's not just a tar spot issue there. I think another thing that's important to point out is that so far we haven't been able to determine if the number of lesions correlates to the amount of yield we lose. So this year's been a perfect example of that. You can go out into pretty much any field right now, in my territory for sure. You can see every plant covered in tar spot, but the yield differences are going to vary quite a bit between hybrids, between how they took different stressors in the field and then how the tar spot compounded on top of that.
So you're telling me that we used to have a hybrid 58-58, right? It was, 58-28 that would get gray leaf spot, right? We get a lot of gray leaves, so show a lot of lesions, but never affected yield. Do you think we'll see that with tar spot? We'll have a hybrid that almost looks like it's covered in it, but it didn't hurt the yield?
Potentially. We take ratings on all the hybrids and we see big differences between different hybrids, but my recommendation is still pick the right hybrid that fits the big picture of what the particular field you're going to place it on is. Tar spot's one piece of that, but it's just one piece of the picture. And then manage accordingly. Use the ratings to guide your scouting and fungicide treatment efforts as opposed to guiding which hybrids you pick. So.
All right, so I'm moving through 2022. I'm picking the best hybrid for my acre, right, in terms of what my management style is. So what's going to be my next steps for making recommendations, Aaron?
Yeah, so in my opinion, I think we want to have a silver bullet. We want to take care of this disease, knock it out. But I think it just goes back to those general pest management practices. So I think the first thing for me is just scouting. As simple as that sounds, we need to be out in those fields. And right around tassel time is about when we're recommending right now, getting out there. Everybody's favorite time to be in a cornfield, that pollen's flying, but that's when we tend to see this disease have its earliest impact and start to get into fields in certain years. So right around tassel, start getting into those fields, scout weekly. Right now, one of the things we're not sure about is if tar spot gets into that plant, and before we see those lesions, what the impact of that infection prior to lesions is. So unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for that, and we can't tell when the plant's there or that disease is there until we start seeing those lesions. So I think, to Mike's point, especially on those more susceptible hybrids, if it's a hybrid that's gone through a lot of stress, and then we start seeing that tar spot show up in that field, that's when we're going to want to implement that plan moving forward. And we sometimes talk about the football analogy here, and we talk about this with nitrogen timing on too. But you think about a football game. So if we start at the beginning of the football game and we have our plan going into that game, and if we try to make all of our decisions based on that same plan throughout the rest of the game, we may win by a lot, we may lose by a lot, but we don't know. But we're taking the same path throughout the whole time. Well, what if we get down by 20 and halftime comes around and we have the opportunity to adjust that plan? So it comes back to the idea that we get to that halftime point. So halftime here is going to be right around that pollination time. So look back at that early part of the season, like Travis was getting to, with the nitrogen loss, with any other stresses that may have happened to that plant, and take that into account when you make that plan going forward, and how we're going to manage this disease.
Okay, so I'm out there, I'm scouting, I find some lesions. So what I do? Call the airplanes, I'm gonna start spraying. What's my plan now?
Well, the first thing you gotta know is what's the day that you're finding it, and what growth stage is your corn at that point. From what we've seen is if you are finding those lesions prior to the dough stage, so dough is when you start to accumulate some dry matter in the kernel, or if you're not sure about the dough stage, dent is much easier to determine. If you're at the dent stage and you're just now seeing lesions, you're pretty well home free at that point. The corn's far enough along, it's not going to be that big a deal. If it's much prior to that dough stage or dent stage, then you probably want to be making some phone calls and getting some applications lined up to get a fungicide on as soon as possible.
The other thing that's going to influence that, Steve, is the environment. We kind of hinted at that earlier, but if you're in a corn-on-corn environment underwater, where you're irrigating a lot, maybe it's dry, right? You've been watering for the last couple of weeks pretty aggressively. I'm more apt to pull the trigger there earlier on, okay, in that whole process, simply because of the environment being conducive for that disease to be more of a problem. So there's lots of different things weaving in here, but unfortunately, that's how we're going to have to manage this disease going forward.
Yeah, and I think we're all alluding to this, but we talk a lot about fungicides, and so we talk a lot about fertilizers right now. We're talking a lot about herbicide availability right now. We don't know what fungicides are going to look like exactly next year, but the best thing I think right now is to make that plan, and I think you should plan to be able to spray fungicide when you need to. Have that fungicide ready to go. There could be scenarios like Mike said where we really don't think we need to make that application, but we don't want to get into a situation where we can't have access to that treatment when we need it.
And coming back to the point we made earlier about the differences among hybrids is, budget that into your plan, work with your Beck dealer, your Beck seed advisor, or us as your agronomist, and figure out which hybrids are going to be more likely to need a fungicide budgeted into the plan as opposed to those that would be getting less likely.
So just go buy any old fungicide. There's been a lot of research on that, right? But we need a lot more work on that. So what do I do? A single mode of action, multiple. What do I look at? What do I look for?
So the universities, particularly Purdue and Michigan State, have been putting together some pretty good efficacy trials of fungicide on tar spot, and we anticipate hopefully those results will be coming out here fairly soon. So that's something to look at. But then you can also look at our PFR proven fungicide list. And the one thing in common with all those is they have multiple modes of action. And from what we found, that holds true with tar spot, just like it does the other diseases that we've dealt with for years, is those products that have 2 or 3 different ways of attacking that disease are going to be the best bet in this situation.
Yeah, I think, as we've talked about this disease and the annual patterns that we've seen, and so this year we've had the most extensive infection that we've seen so far, definitely some of the most severe infections. So I think as Mike talked about the university data, that's going to be really important this year. I think they're going to have some really good data this year to share with us. So stay tuned for some of that. We'll share it with you. Look for those university plant pathologists, extension specialists. They're going to give us a lot of good information on which fungicides. They're even looking at a lot of timings of when to spray. They've got a lot of research coming out, and I think this is going to be a good year to have good data.
All right, so in the story of tar spot, what have we missed, right? We talked about the cycle, we talked about conditions, we talked about recommendations. Any last minute things you want to throw out there to everybody to keep in mind?
I'd say the biggest thing is just as you're evaluating this year, just to reiterate, just because the tar spot's the most visible and the new disease in the block doesn't mean that that's the cause of any challenges we have out in the field. So evaluating, understanding, looking past that to learn from this year what we can, but then just making sure that we're prepared next year to have a plan that if tar spot becomes a problem, we're ready for it. Doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster, but we just want to be prepared. So.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and educating us on tar spot today. And like they said, if you've got questions, reach out to your Beck's representative, your dealer, your seed advisor, the agronomy team. We would love to help you out. We're going to be gathering a lot of data. We're working on the PFR book. It'll be coming out shortly, so you'll be able to learn what we talked about with the PFR proven fungicide. So check that out. And thank you for listening.